Hi and welcome. My name's Neil and this is the second Partial Historians episode, where I was a guest and continue to talk about the sites and spaces in ancient Rome which link back to the Regal period and the myths therein. In this one, I continued with the Tullianum and a fruit controversy. I argue my case then for a structure which I think is the most important in early Rome. After that, there's the Circus Maximus, Ostia, and the challenges in learning more about all of these places. Listening back, I still sound a bit manic at points, and I repeat the point I made in the intro for the first episode. This is largely me just being me. As before, a big shout out to the fab partial historians. Dr. Rad and Dr. G were fantastic hosts, and they do a great job with their podcast. Please go and listen to it, and also check out their books. Rex, the Seven Kings of Rome, is very pertinent to this episode, in fact both episodes, as we talk about kings in both of them, and their cheeky guide to the Roman Empire is also well worth a read. You can find them on social media as Partial Historians on Instagram and Blue Sky, and as I mentioned before, they also have the Partial Historians YouTube channel. I'm Ancient Blogger on Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, X and Blue Sky, and of course there is the Ancient History Hound subreddit. Plenty of places to come and say hi. Okay, well, again, I hope you enjoyed the discussion and feel free to get in touch.
Welcome to the Partial Historians.
We explore all the details of ancient Rome.
Everything from political scandals, the love affairs, the battles waged, and when citizens turn against each other. I'm Dr. Rad.
And I'm Dr. G. We consider Rome as the Romans saw it, by reading different authors from the ancient past and comparing their stories.
Join us as we trace the journey of Rome from the founding of the city.
Hello and welcome to this very special episode of the Partial Historians. I am Dr. G.
And I am Dr. Rad.
And we are really, really excited to welcome back Neil for what is part 2 of our extravaganza exploration of Regal Rome in terms of its layout and what's going on with like the landscape and things like this. So, as you know, Neil is the founder of the popular Ancient Blogger website and is also the host of the Ancient History Hound podcast. So, welcome back, Neil.
Hello, thank you very much for having me back on again. You just don't learn, is what I'm getting out of all this. You know. No.
It is very few rare guests who get to come back for a second time.
That's
Consider
true,
yourself
that's
in
true.
excellent company.
It's a bit like when a teacher says, when you meet up with a teacher later on in your life and they say, I remember you from school, and that's rarely a good thing.
Often that is the presage of some nasty stories where you're like, oh wow, I was that kid.
Oh, I thought I was quiet. No. But thank you very much for having me back on. Apologies to everyone listening. I've visited London recently to go to the British Museum to see an exhibition there, which I had great fun at. And of course, I've picked up the lurgy or a cold or something. So if I'm sounding a bit sinusy, that is, I'm fighting against it with rapid amounts of various Lemsipy type things. So I'll try and be as cogent and as clear as I can be, but stick with me if you can.
I think you sound very smooth.
I was going to say, as Australians, we tend to, we really quite enjoy the English accent. It does has a bit of a historical resonance for us, so you really can't do any wrong.
Well, I actually got some feedback I get some occasional feedback on like my YouTube channel, and I had someone give me feedback the other day, couldn't last 1 minute with his voice. Fair enough. I just didn't know my mum was on YouTube. I was sort of way beyond her, but there we go. It's a bit harsh. But...
Look, you can't please them all. We're
Yeah,
constantly told off for laughing and
yeah.
cackling and being immature. So
Yeah, how dare you do history and have fun at the same time?
I know.
I take umbrage.
This is very serious stuff. Yeah.
I get off very lightly. I've got to be honest with you. I don't have much in the way of criticism. I have nice comments, which is always nice, but I appreciate that people sometimes get some real unfair stuff come their way. Just remember, if you're listening to this, most people who do your podcast do it because they're a hobby. They do it because they love the subject, and all they're trying to do is share that subject with you. They're just trying to get ideas across, topics across, and helping you think about a particular area. No one's charging you necessarily anything, and so sometimes just bear that in mind, because I always think of it like shops. If I'm walking along a parade of shops, and I don't need to go into a particular shop to buy an item, I don't go into that shop and tell them they're wrong for stocking that item. I just go past the shop. And I think with podcasts, sometimes we have I think it's because culturally we're not yet fine-tuned. We haven't worked out how to critique podcasts correctly. So you can go into these, as I said, the shops and think about it. Again, I go past things all the time. I'm not interested in buying. I do not go into that shop and go, you know what? That those size 9 high heels you've got in the window, useless. I'd never wear those. I'm not buying. I'm not interested. Not only that, I don't even like them. I think you're wrong for having them in the shop window. People would be just looking at you going, "You okay? Do you need some help?" But that's the way sometimes people.
And they'd also be saying, Neil, come on, we know you want those shoes.
Yeah. And well, they probably look at me and go, with those calves, probably not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Anyway.
Maybe wax first, but yeah.
here's a bag.
Yeah, but no, you know what? You're very right. I don't think everybody does understand podcasting, particularly for independents like ourselves. I've certainly talked to some very intelligent friends of mine who've never really put it together that we don't necessarily get paid per se. Like, we're very lucky to have Patreon supporters, as I think you probably are as well. But it's still not like a paid job, and it's certainly not enough that we can quit our full-time paying jobs to go and do the podcasting.
It's certainly one of the biggest misnomers. Most people do podcasting. In fact, they're sort of 99.9% of doing it. It's a hobby. They're not making money out of it, and they're just trying to create something that people like. So when you're listening to it, if you can give back criticism, and I'm always up for constructive criticism, I'm fine with that. And people have come back and said, actually, I've had some in the past. That might work better, or I enjoyed this, but you know what? That wasn't so good. Great. It's just that kind of mindlessness sometimes of the comment. It's like, what are you trying to do? What's the achievement value for you by submitting me that? Anyway, I apologize, but if you are listening and you are listening to podcasts currently, sometimes it's just nice to tell people that you really enjoy their stuff, and if you've got constructive criticism, give it, but just make it constructive, because we just want to live our lives and go on with it, because it's pretty tough sometimes. So anyway, there we go.
How dare you refuse to change your voice for a listener, Neil?
No, fair enough. Actually, on another one, another one, I did have someone call out that I was a bit heavy to be a hoplite, because I was showcasing a shield.
Ouch.
To be fair enough, it was
goodness.
just like I didn't have any call out. I'm like, yeah, you know what? I'm a bit overweight and I'm a bit overage as well, because I am not a lithe 19-year-old leaping around the battlefield. But yeah,
But also, we just have so much more access to food.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like the modern world feeds us very well indeed. And it's like your chances of looking like a hoplite from the ancient world, slim to none. I mean, they're eating a very different diet.
Well, actually, that's one of the things that often comes up. There was a point that came up recently about Roman soldiers, and this whole thing about this height requirement for Roman soldiers, and it gets bandied around a lot, and it works out roughly 5'7", and this comes from a source which is late 4th century AD. It's Vegetius, who writes this treatise on the Roman army. He says, well, you need to be this height, and people take from that was an absolute given out across all of the entirety of the Roman army. And in fairness, I did see it when I went up to the Legion exhibition at the British Museum, which was great. And I even had a photo taken of me next to the thing, not making the height requirement. But people,
You're out.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I was out. And what people don't realize is that I've had it. Sometimes people said, well, everyone was just shorter back then, and it wasn't people were shorter. I mean, yes, they probably were. It was just they didn't have the ability to fulfill their, they weren't exposed to the kind of diet that we are, well, many people are, not everyone, many people are in the Western world, as it were now, or just across the planet, where you can eat. You're not starving. You're not nutritiously deficient in any way. So you could have plenty of people who may have been over 6 foot kicking around ancient Rome, as it were, but they never had the diet when they were children to be able to reach that. You know, genetics can set you up in terms of your physiology, as I understand it. But what you do to achieve that doesn't mean it'll always happen. So if you can get somebody who might be 6'2", but if you don't feed them right, they might, their growth is going to be incapacitated in some way. You put blockers on that. But anyway, yeah. So there we go. We've brought it back to ancient Rome. So I'm happy.
Indeed, I'm always happy to talk about the vertically challenged army of ancient Rome.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go back to the geography of early Rome, if we may. And I'm going to kick it off with something that is quite near and dear to my heart, because I am going to openly admit, Dr. G, that I wrote the chapters on the kings Tullus Hostilius and Servius Tullius in our book.
Just in case people hadn't realized.
Just in case somehow my unique style and never-ending popular culture references were lost on you. And so that brings me to ask you about a particular building, the Tullianum, which may be named after either of those kings that we were just talking about. We're not really sure which one. So Livy claims that this may have been constructed by Ancus Marcius, but I don't believe that, Dr. G, because you wrote about him.
I was going to say, that was my chapter.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Now, archaeologists have done their darndest, but the exact location of this structure is still a bit of a mystery. There has been a theory put forward that the Tullianum might be the ancient vault that was found under the church of Saint Giuseppe de Falegnami. However, even the dating of this space seems to only go back as far as the 2nd century BCE. So can you tell us, what is the Tullianum and what tales from Regal Rome are connected to it?
Well, I don't want to incite chapter wars, but obviously if anyone's read the book, they can get back to both of the authors and tell them who wrote the better chapters. I'm just, I'll leave it there. But thank you very much about the Tullianum. Yes, the way to think about the Tullianum, and I did think about the best way to understand it, is almost starting at the wrong end of things. So we want to start around the time of Livy and think what Livy was seeing. So again, we'll work on the premise that it is under that church that you mentioned. So we'll take that again. These all comes with caveats of further things may give us more clues and more ideas, and we always have that. That's why whenever I'm talking about anything, I'm always very, very delicate about giving an absolute, because two days after you release an episode, you've written something, an incredible discovery scotches everything. Now, when Livy was looking around, he would have noticed there was a structure, and the structure, by his point, was quite famous. This was, and it's known in the modern time as the Mamertine prison, though that was a much later reference to it. You had, and apologies for my pronunciation again, but you had two structures, the one above ground, which was the carcer or carca, and then you had one below it. And it's the underground structure that's the one that interests us. Sometimes this is referred to as part of the carca or carcer, but we also know it as, or refer to it as, the Tullianum. Now, for Livy, it made perfect sense. He had this structure above ground, so that must have come first, and the structure below ground presumably was later. So he retrospectively seems to apply the structure, the above ground structure, to Ancus, and then he sort of suggests that the second one was built later by Tullius. And it makes sense, because after all, look, it's called the Tullianum, so it must be linked, because again, naming conventions in ancient Rome, very often things are named after a person, or they're given that backstory. That's something that can be easily attached to them. And he is writing a story. Let's never forget that with Livy. He's trying to make his reader interested in things that have happened in the past, and he's also not going to conduct extensive archaeological interest or excavations into these buildings.
Oh, so come on, Livy. You got to work on your method.
Yeah, get your trowel out, Livy. I've always said it. So what we're looking at there, so the Tullianum, and I thought of another way of considering it, and I dare say both of your good selves and everyone listening here would have walked around and they would have seen a building that's changed use. In the UK, there's a sort of chain of development that seems to occur. Something used to be a bank that turns into a pub, that gets shut down many years later, that becomes a block of flats or becomes something else. And so if you look at some of these buildings and go, well, hang on a sec, that must have been always. It's just an odd looking building, but it must always have been an office or a block of flats. You actually know it's been repurposed, it's been rechanged. Originally, it was built like this. And there are famous examples. I think it's the Louvre, the museum in Paris, that was originally a palace, and then it got changed. And that's not huge, I suppose, a huge leap of change for a particular building, particularly in France, where they didn't really have many kings kicking around after a certain point to have buildings for. But with the Tullianum, it's really interesting because what Livy's trying to do is make sense of what he's seen and retrospectively fit that. But what we have is a bit of a curiosity. So the idea was that the Tullianum was this underground, by Livy's time, underground. I say dungeon. I don't like calling it that, but it was kind of a holding cell, and it was a holding cell for the famous people such as Vercingetorix. All of those people who were involved in the Catalan conspiracy were apparently held there, and after which they would be executed, and sometimes they would be ritually strangled down there, such as I think it's Vercingetorix who that occurs to. But the issue with it is that that's what Livy was seeing, and archaeology and other sort of works, and again with the caveat of more things will come out, has determined there was probably a very different use. And this use seems to have been that of a spring or a cistern. And the rationale behind that is because it's an odd structure. This is, and it's been changed a lot because in the modern, even in the say the ancient Roman times, the later building of the Carca or Casa, which I think dates to around the second century BC or thereabouts, that seems to have changed the structure below it quite a bit. So they think it's several meters, it's 2 meters high or so, a circular building. I think it's about 7 meters in diameter or thereabouts. And the premise seems to have been that this was a tholos type design, which if anyone who's listens or knows much about ancient Greek architecture will immediately think of. This is a circular thing with a dome sometimes, and it was a system. And not only was it a system, like many systems in ancient Rome, it was linked to a deity. It would have been sacred. It would have been given some religious provenance on some level, which is actually ironic given what I'll come to in a bit. And so that's what they thought the original design was. And when they looked at a section of the walls, they actually came across the type of wall structure. It seemed like ancient the way it was built. They said this is archaic. This looks pretty much like a cistern, which has been found elsewhere on the Palatine and around that time. It's common pattern of the way that the wall was structured. However, when they looked at the stone, and I read a paper with incredible amounts of letters after numbers because they did sort of various isotope stuff on the walls of the remaining structure, what they could get to, because again, it has a religious connotation now. So you can't just go around and start, chopping these things up and removing and excavating. They found that the stone dates to probably around the 4th century BC. It's a particular type of stone that Rome doesn't get access to around that time or seems to pop up a lot. And so the question is, why would you have an older structure with newer stone? And one argument which sort of appeases this, and I think works quite well, is this was a really important religious or spring that had religious prominence to it, and therefore it had been reclad, rebuilt, which isn't an unusual thing. You're just using more recent and better uh, tools and better construction materials to rebuild it, and you do that because it was important. So the idea was that this, in fact, was, as I said, a spring, a sacred spring that filled a cistern. And then you go, well, hang on a sec. You've both said Tullus. Well, we got Tullius there. We've got Servus and we got Hostilius. So where does that link in? Well, it's been argued that actually the word Tullus is Latin or comes from the Latin to mean spring or jet of water. So again, this links into Livy trying to find a way to connect dots which may not be there, but building a logical picture. And I'm not going to criticize him for it because I think it's a relatively good way of considering what he saw. There's also another element to all of this, and that's apparently there was a gate in the Servian walls called the Porta Fontinalis, and this allegedly gave access to a sacred spring, and it's thought that this gate was near to where the current site is. So this might be the sacred spring that was linked to that gate. And there is, and I'll finish up with, I'll finish up with actually three things of note. First of all, the Romans had some they did really cruel, horrible stuff. But sometimes, as we'll see later, particularly, they had some quite fancy festivals that just seemed kind of, yeah, that seems like a nice thing. On October the 13th, they had the Fontinalia, which was where wells were adorned with flowers. And I think that's really quite nice. Sort of obviously a celebration of how important these things were. And again, need to remember that flowing water often had this religious connotation to it. Springs were often where people, I wondered actually, and I couldn't find anything to link this in, but Numa's, the nymph Egeria, whether or not she was linked possibly to this spring. Again, I don't know, because she was said to hang around a spring. But I am now going to give you, well, a bit of controversy, and I can kind of see that the finger of Damocles is sort of hovering above the edit button on this one, because I'm going to say one thing: lemons. So there is quite a controversy in ancient Rome about lemons and when lemons became introduced. Now, I know full well that there are some lovely frescoes from Pompeii, and they seem to depict lemons. Or do they? Some people have argued that they depict the citron fruit. I see Dr. Rad looking around, they're going, hang on a sec, I thought that was definitely a lemon. It's quite a controversial thing, believe it or not, because, and again, things that you end up reading that you don't necessarily, you end up going down rabbit holes. There were various papers done on evidence of sort of citron fruit. Now, to identify citron fruit, particularly lemons, is really quite difficult because different pips, and you've got to look at pollen, and it can be difficult to distinguish these. And they have found evidence of citron pollen in and around Naples. Not enough, apparently, in quantities that are dense enough to suggest there was farming going on, but there was certainly citrons, and an argument has been that lemons were around in the time of Pompeii. And that's possibly true, because the only piece of definitive, or the earliest piece of definitive lemons being anything in Rome, is found in the Tullianum, where they found lemon seeds that they were able, this dates to Augustan period, they were able to specifically date, or not date them, but identify them, because citron pollen, citron seeds can often look very similar to each other, and they had this. So there we go. In case you've got that gap in your life, it's now well and truly filled. You know that lemons were certainly a thing around Augustan Rome, and we know that from the Tullianum. The other thing is the fact that this whole idea of a spring and it having religious connotations has shifted across, because there is, again, I don't know enough about the Catholic Church to know whether or not this is fully endorsed, but I suspect it is in some way. But you can apparently visit St. Peter's. It was a site, rather, of one of St. Peter's miracles when he was held at Rome. He wanted to baptize a bunch of people, and guess what? He's struck the earth of the Tullianum, and a spring emerged, and from that he was able to baptize a bunch of people. So again, you have this link of a spring being based within the Tullianum. You can't get away from that being a central function to it. It's just interesting how Rome, again, adapted and evolved what was already there to possibly something very separate. It was by the time of Livy, possibly a holding cell. And it may have been this whole sacred spring thing, that was lost in the memory. And then again, this points to something that I've mentioned, we spoke about in the first episode, where even within ancient Rome, things got lost, things got remembered, things got reinvented. It wasn't this monolithic block of time where everyone is considering what happened in, 5th century BC. That was just a week ago. 1st century BC, nothing's changed. Everything's changed. So we always need to remember that, there was within ancient Rome, there was an ancient or more ancient Rome that it knew of and tried to work out. Anyway, so those are my thoughts and some things about the Tullianum.
Oh, look, I'm very intrigued by the lemon seeds. It makes me wonder what on earth was going on in that holding cell. Was it something nice, like them saying, oh, yes, I'd like some water with just a slice of lemon, please?
While I'm down here, I'm going to make some limoncello. Why not?
Exactly. Or was it more like, yeah, you made some bad life decisions. Here's some lemons. Try and make lemonade out of them. I dare you.
Classic Romans, I would say. Yeah, look,
Yeah.
I think that's really fascinating. There are so many springs in and around Rome. It's just the nature of the geography, and all of them are considered sacred in particular ways. So it's interesting to try and tease out particular details relating to a singular one. But I think this actually leads in really nicely, this idea of springs, into my question for you. And I know this is a topic dear to your heart, the cloaca maxima. So, thinking about things that might be watery, but maybe
Yes.
in a less pleasant way.
I'm actually going to throw a question back to the both of you good selves. It's more of an exercise, a mental exercise. And for anyone listening, I suggest you do this as well. And the question is this: could Rome have developed and achieved what it did without the Forum? So if it didn't have access to the Forum, could it have achieved what it did? It might have done. But if after considering that question, your answer, your conclusion is no, it couldn't have done, then the Cloaca Maxima is possibly the most important structure in ancient Rome, certainly the early development of it, because without the Cloaca Maxima, you do not have the Roman Forum. And I can get into the whys of that in a moment. So,
Excellent, excellent. Setting up the mystery.
yeah, the mystery of it is something that I spoke about prior, and this relates to flooding. And here we come with some numbers. So, the problem that we have with the Forum, or the area that came to become the Forum, is it's in a valley, and it's between the Capitoline and the Palatine Hill. Now, being in a valley, it was prone to flooding. The bigger problem was quite extensive flooding. At the time before it was developed, it sat at around 6.9 meters above sea level, which sounds quite high up. And you think, that's not too bad. Except the problem was that the seasonal floods from the Tiber could reach up to 9 meters above sea level. So what we seem to have in play then, and again, this is more identifiable through some of the archaeology that's done, because we can sort of see, or what the work has been able to see, that there's been these layers of material that have been laid on the Forum, and it raised it up by around 3 meters. And it seems that this work undertook a lot of time between the 7th century. It was probably discontinued and then carried on, and the amount of material required was around 20,000 cubic meters. Now, I don't know what 20,000 cubic meters look like. I don't know how big that is, but I did some basic sums. And if you've got a wheelbarrow in your garden, like an average wheelbarrow, it would take 235,000 trips with that wheelbarrow to move that amount of material.
Dear Lord.
Yeah, that's a lot of movement. Now, of course, the problem with raising this is that you had the issue of drainage, because in this area it suggested that there was a narrow stream, but also you had the floods. Now, you can go about raising the level of that area, but the problem is, the minute it floods, the minute you've got that stream running through the middle of the Forum, it just erodes everything. All your good work completely gone. So what's been suggested that early on, the cloaca was simply a way of redirecting that drain, and as they raised the level of the Forum, so it grew. So you build up the sides of it. So what you seem to have had was a double channel. So you had parallel channels of a parallel channel about 3 meters wide, or just over 3 meters, with a wall in the middle, and 3 meters high by the time it was finished. And this seems to have done the job in being able to redirect water away from the Forum, so then you could pave it over. The big kind of controversy over this is whether or not it was open or paved, because again, this wasn't a sewer, and I'll get to that in a moment. This wasn't a sewer in the conventional sense. This was just a way of draining the area. So it's been argued that the fact that it was uncovered at one point, with just some areas that were being covered, so you could move across it. Others say this didn't happen until the 2nd century BC. Some have said, no, actually, this was from day one. It was always covered. And that was the standard, because we can see drainage channels elsewhere. And in fact, there was an interesting drainage channel that seems to have occurred a bit later on in Cumae. And that's, funny enough, where the last Roman king ends up in exile. So this idea is that there's the technology is well known about, and it's something that people are quite proud of having. In fact, it's something you'd showcase. It was a mark of distinction to have this kind of engineering feat, because that's what it was within your city, within your the city that you boasted of. So this is what this did, and it's quite it's quite a fascinating thing because people, and I've had chats with people since on this. In the later Roman imperial period, it's really quite difficult to get across just how much surface water there was kicking around. And the Cloaca Maxima, by the way, gets expanded. I mean, it gets really expanded. By the time of Livy, you had, I mean, again, the modern analogy I'll give is, think if you're old enough like me, you can remember when the internet was about 4 websites. And you can remember when there was Ask Jeeves and Netscape or whatever it was, that was the pre-Google times and all of this kind of thing. And obviously now you see it's completely different. This was a very basic, advanced in itself, but a very basic structure that was then added to. So now what you have is, you have, when people look at it and they excavate it, you've got these different parts of it that are much newer than other parts of it because it's had to be developed and changed and rebuilt, extended, and everything in subsequent periods, which again makes things more difficult because how do you see what the original bit was? So that's what you have with the cloaca, and it's absolutely, like I say, absolutely fascinating, particularly in regards to how it functioned as a sewer, because it was generally there to take away surface water. You've got, by the time of the imperial period, you've got a lot of water that's coming from fountains, off roofs. There's been extensive repaving, so you've got all this runoff, all this stuff. One of the big things that come out, and again, I was talking to kids in schools, always love this, is the idea that the toilets might have been connected, but largely weren't, based on the evidence that we have, particularly at Pompeii, where there's quite a lot of surviving structures that you can see that toilets weren't connected to the sewer, they weren't connected to the Cloaca Maxima. Did human waste end up there? Yeah, it did. But the thing was, we think of it slightly different. For a Roman, or certainly the Roman period, the idea of using water to flush away human waste wasn't really the most obvious way of dealing with it, because human waste could be used in a number of ways. A main one was as fertilizer, and you had people who would come along and collect it and actually buy it from people. Now, imagine if you're someone who lives if you're a poor Roman, so the majority of Romans probably, and you live in an insula, live in a small building where you probably have a chamber pot, and your chamber pot would empty into a larger I suppose, a larger pot or some container. That container might be taken away, dumped outside. That seems to be the case at Pompeii. But also, the owner of the insulae might have a deal, and you might be selling it as fertilizer. If you were someone who had a house with a toilet in it, it wasn't a toilet. This was a sort of waste disposal, often in the kitchen as well. The idea would be that solid waste would be put in there. It could then drain through the rock, and people would then come around and they would buy it off you. You would have slaves if you had a toilet. I mean, most people had slaves anyway, but you'd certainly have a suite of slaves, as it were, if you had a private home a home with a private toilet, and that would probably be one of their jobs. One of the things you wouldn't have occurred to Romans would be to use water to flush it away, because why would you? Now, there's a separate argument to be made in the case of baths and things like that, but you've got to think about Roman baths as quite an unusual, even though there were a lot of them. This is a later sort of imperial time when Roman baths really become a thing in ancient Rome. Obviously, there are some at Pompeii, and there are some that date a bit earlier than they did, we think, at Rome. But in either case, just flushing and having that as the equation of dealing with waste just didn't make sense to Rome on many levels. And you could do other stuff with it. And there was one final story. Well, actually, there were a couple reasons why you wouldn't want your toilet connected if you did live in Rome to the sewer. The first would be, well, if the Tiber floods, you've got a lot of fun coming your way. The second one was rats. You've basically got a super highway for any kind of rats or anything to come back up through the toilet. And the other one, and please don't laugh at this when I say the words gas traps. So you'd have a lot of methane building up. Yeah, you've both been put on mute, but you're laughing like children. I'm disgusted. I thought this was meant to be a distinguished academic discussion. Stop having fun. We'll get complaints. And the idea was that if you had build up a methane and it's going to come back up through that particular receptacle, and it's in a kitchen, well, Romans were quite big on candles. So you've got to watch out from that. And one final one is one that I get a similar reaction from telling kids as I do adults, and it is very much an outlier. So don't take this as a reason. But Elian gave a great story on animals, and I don't know if either of you heard this. It's a bit of a mystery. there's this merchant who owned a stock room or like a storeroom or something, and it wasn't a Rome. It was on he was a Spanish merchant, and I forget it was somewhere in Italy, but it was near the coast. And he had his stock room, and one day he goes into the stock room, and his pickled fish have been raided. There's bits of pot everywhere, and he's just baffled by it because the locks, no one's gotten through the door. The lock's fine. What's happened there? Well, he then takes one of his slaves and says, "Right, you're staying up tonight. I just wanted to see anyone comes in, scare them off. Here you go." So he did. Slave come back the next morning. The slave's absolutely terrified. Can't get many words out of him. Invariably, they do because he's a slave, and he talks about the fact that early in the morning he was looking over in the corner, and the toilet was connected to the sewer, and out of the sewer came this huge octopus, who then continued to help himself to all the pickled fish and everything else, and then went back in.
Delicious.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they end up getting the octopus. It doesn't end too well, and it's one of those stories which you think, sounds good, doesn't it? Until more recently, when there was those number of those stories of octopus escaping various aquariums and end up, getting into an Uber and going downtown, having a good time of it, coming back home 4 a.m. Whoop, got to go back home. They were just incredible, and perhaps something that we
And
don't
telling
quite
the
realize.
future as well.
Yeah, they yeah, yes, they could do all sorts of things, predicting elections. They can do pretty much everything.
Yeah. Yeah, if it was going to be anything, I'd believe it that it was an octopus.
I would definitely be definitely a fan of that. So with the Cloaca Maxima, what you've got there, to go back to it, is originally this would have been built as the forum was being developed, because again, you're raising the level of the forum, you've got to keep this drainage ditch intact and to do its job and to take away that surface water. You don't have the forum. Simply, you do not have a forum because you do not have the ability to reclaim that land, which is a huge thing. Because when you walk around Rome now, you don't quite realize how different it was. And I don't mean the obvious things. I mean just the topography. So I think the archaeological level for ancient Rome, as it were, is around 10 meters below the current level or thereabouts. And obviously, it's going to differ in places. But it was far higher and far lower in certain areas than it is now. In fact, you'd be quite surprised if you could do. There is a model, I believe, in Rome, which I've seen a few times, and it's absolutely fascinating, where they've got archaic Rome, and it's just a place of these hills and just hills and valleys. You don't get the sense of that as much now, but it would have been back then. So drainage was really important, and as such, the Cloaca Maxima was really important.
I definitely believe you. Rome does have a reputation for being a bit swampy at times.
Well, that was one of the reasons they didn't, or Rome had real problems with the Campus Martius. They had the issue around there. It was really swampy, and they did have a big problem with drainage in Rome, certainly in the early stages of it.
No, I always think of Campus Martius, and I know it's named after Mars, but I always think, what marsh is in its name as well?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the marshy Martius.
Exactly.
So switching gears a little bit from gas and all sorts of delightful things that you might find in a sewer, let's talk a little bit about the Circus Maximus. So it's not necessarily the thing that springs into people's minds when they think of Rome. That usually goes to the Colosseum, which is now seen as like this symbol of ancient Rome in the city. However, the Circus Maximus is much, much older than the Colosseum, and therefore definitely worthy of our attention. So what made the Circus Maximus so special? And why is it an important structure to think about when we're exploring the geography of the Regal period?
Okay, so I explain my boo to start with. I like the Colosseum. I've been there, I've walked around it, and I've gone in it. But for me, I'm old school. I'm Circus Maximus. In fact, I thought about my dream job, and my dream job would have been marketing consultant for the Circus Maximus around AD 80. And I would have had things on the wall saying, yeah, Circus Maximus, but the clowns are at the Colosseum, that kind of thing. I would have gone full in. There would have been hashtags everywhere. So the Circus Maximus actually links in, before I go in even more, Circus Maximus links in to the Cloaca Maxima, because it's thought that there's a similar technology that was being exchanged there, because this is in a valley between the Aventine and Palatine hills. So if you're walking, again, we used our clock analogy in the previous episode. If you're looking at Rome and you've got the Forum Bararium at the center of the clock, you're looking at sort of between 4 and 5 o'clock here, and that valley is between that valley runs sort of southeast or southeast, that in that kind of general direction. It was prone to drainage, and there are elements of it which seem to have been forgotten but sort of remembered in some of the rituals and associations I'll come to in a moment. But the initial problem they had was how do you get hold of this really nice piece of land? Again, Rome, as it's trying to develop and expand, you can't just live on hills. You need flat land to do stuff on. And what you have in what is not, I think it's the Murcia Valley, is actually the technical term for where the Circus Maximus is you have an alluvial plain, apparently, which was seems to be like an old flooding plain, or used to be a river there, or some such. And what you have are two channels, and you have a sort of build-up of material between those two channels. And so what Rome does is it takes that physical topography and amends it slightly and creates the Circus Maximus. Those two channels become the tracks. That central build-up of material becomes the spina, that bit in the middle of the track where in later periods you have all those fancy statues and whatnot. And so what they're doing is they're taking advantage of what's already there, but they're slightly rebuilding it. And it's also involves, by the way, drainage. It's thought that there was drainage channels either side of that central bank and going around the edges of the track. If you were to look at it above, think of a cartoon where you have a magnet, and it's like that big C shape, that elongated C shape. That's what you have at the sort of Circus Maximus. Now, obviously, at the time of the Regal period, you've got to get rid of any thoughts of how it looked like when you're probably thinking about it in its heyday, when it's got 250,000 people allegedly being able to turn up there and all of this kind of thing. It was simply a track where you could run various events, and there was one particular event that they had there. And what they did was they took the track and they started to understand that you can have let's say contests there, things which people like to watch. Now, what I found really interesting is initially you have this social standing, literal social standing, because early on you've got Livia and Dionysus both explaining that you have temporary seating allocated, but you got only certain classes could do this. So you've got a space in Rome by which people can be seen and they can be marked out as distinguished. So it's really important early on because people get to show how important they are because they can have temporary wooden seating. But if you're really poor, you don't get that. And there's in terms of dating it, we're looking at the Regal period. Certainly, the earliest piece of, I'd say, physical evidence there is a stone seat, which dates to 494 BC, and apparently it was for Manius Valerius Maximus. So we have a definitive date there of something being, and of course you won't have a stone seat just overnight. That had to be as a result of further development. The early games they had there were horse racing and boxing, both very important and very popular. And you think of the funeral games at Patroclus, you think of the Olympics. These were events which were central to both of those things. And these were also apparently from Etruria. So again, this seems to be of an imported thing. And it was also apparently the location of the Sabine women, the instance involving the Sabine women. So I probably don't need to go over that. I'm sure that people will realize or understand that one of the things Romulus arranged was a sort of mass abduction, hijacking, and worse of women from the Sabine group at an event. And this event was said to have occurred at the Circus Maximus, or the site of the Circus Maximus. And apparently it was the Consualia, which was in itself a really nice festival. So to distance what happened at it, it was a really nice festival because the Romans, as I said, as an animal lover, one of the reasons I could never go to ancient Rome, and people, would you like to go back there? No, I couldn't. Most people, I think, wouldn't. They say, I'd love to go to the Colosseum and watch. No, you wouldn't. Because most people, and I say this with a big caveat of most people, haven't seen the sort of horrors that you'd see there. You've seen it in films, not seen it in real life. You'd be traumatized. I would be equally as traumatized by the way that animals were treated in certain instances. I know there's a recent thing that they found at Pompeii where you had mules that were basically just walking around in circles for their entire lives. So yeah, there was this element of horrible treatment of animals, which I'll move away from. But this was a really nice instance of animals being treated nicely because the Romans recognized how nice horses and mules were, and they decorated them. They gave them garlands. They had a kind of little My Little Pony festival for them, and they had little races for them. And all that sort of thing. And this is actually what's interesting is later on the Olympic Games. I just bring the Olympic Games in here because that's the other uh, big famous games. That becomes the Olympic Games incorporates equestrian events because they're primarily about wealth. Originally, the Olympic Games weren't Olympic Games; they were a single foot race for I think it's a good few hundred years, or variations of foot races. The equestrian events start occurring a bit later on, and they're there purely because people realize that it's a really good place where they can showcase their wealth. So this is a good way of again showcasing your wealth and everything else. And they did have events for horses. We always think of the big chariot races, but they used to have like mule races and little cart and traps. I think trap racing, that sort of similar events to that used to go on. They even had one where you went the last lap you ran. So you would go on your horse around, and this is Olympic Games, and the last event you get off and you'd run with your horse.
I've got to buy myself an advantage by getting the horse out the front real quick, so
Yeah.
I can.
That also sounds like a fast track to being trampled.
Well, the origins of this, it's thought that this actually related to cavalry engagements, because one of the things that sometimes again isn't fully realized is that we think of cavalry engagements in antiquity, and there's some confusion exactly how they undertook. So you think of Alexander the Great, and you think of knights, and you think of people charging around on horses, fighting people. Well, that did happen, but earlier on, certainly it didn't, and there was definitely a school of cavalry engagement, which seems to indicate. I think it's Livy who mentions in one engagement where people would get off. So it would be like dragoons, I think it is. You used your horse to get to the location you need to, and then you'd fight on foot. Very often you'd be using the horse to chase down, or where you had a full advantage, you needed mobility. But the idea that everyone was like charging around on the horses, fighting the horses, not necessarily the case for a number of reasons. And when you look at some of the equestrian games and the Olympic Games, you see that there's a lot of that. I mean, there are other ones where you've got the dancing and the running, racing armor at the Olympic Games and things like that. So there's a lot of sort of military virtue exposed there, and I suspect that's a similar thing that's going on at the Circus Maximus. You've got boxing, which was brutal. If it went by the rules of the Olympic Games, then there weren't rounds. You just basically punched each other until, and there were some horrible stories of people swallowing their teeth so they wouldn't look like they've been hit too hard. And I even remember reading one instance was when if it went on too long, they just had a punch off. So it was a case if you punch me, I punch you, and then whoever things like that. So it was pretty brutal. But again, it was highly. This was a high cultural moment which occurred at the Circus Maximus early on, and again you've got that involvement of the horses. You've also got a bit of and this is what I referred to earlier, with a mixture of things going on because you have the mystery altar. So at the end of the one in the turning points, the Termae. So you had a simple track. So if you're in Rome at this point, you've got a simple track with drainage channels on it, and you've got some people who are able to stand on wooden seating. And of course, you wouldn't have anything permanent up. Why would you have something permanent up when it could flood, when it could rot, the rest of it? No, you just put up when you need to. And there seems to be a god associated here called Consus, and Consus was apparently god of the grain and harvest, but he apparently also had an altar underneath that final turning point, and it was buried. And the way it was unearthed, and it seems to be of a secret nature, and it's interested. The Dionysius of Halicarnassus, actually, and I'll quote here. He says the subterranean altar was erected later to a certain divinity whose name may not be uttered, who presides over and is the guardian of hidden councils. Now, this might be because he can't say consus, because apparently you weren't meant to if you were considering as God of Secrets. Not very good God of Secrets if you tell everyone your name. But even so, there's something going on there. And people have thought, well, what's the association with wheat and grain there? And it's thought, well, perhaps prior to the Circus Maximus being established there, it could have been a location where wheat was grown, which we also have possibly again at the Campus Martius. Have you these low-lying areas where you can have some agricultural produce going on, because again, Rome doesn't have many flat places, so it needs to find it's growing things anywhere that it can do. And of course, by the time of Livy, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, they've kind of mixing things up. So originally the Consuelia is meant to be for Neptune, who is Poseidon for the Greek, or his a version of him. I should underline that heavily. A version of him in the Greek pantheon is Poseidon, always associated with horses. So again, it's this weird crossover. So possibly there could have been something earlier there involving consus, involving wheat, which apparently could also be stored underground, which is why they may have had this altar tomb underground. And then later it's absorbed and rolled into this wider festival that's held there at the Consuelia, which is then allocated to a particular event with the Sabines. And this wouldn't be the first instance that Rome does that. Roman religious system, which is quite ironic given how small c conservative Roman religion could be in some instances, loves accommodating other elements to it. You have the Saturnalia, which incorporates the Lectisternium at the end of the 3rd century BC, which was a Greek festival. There is this often enrichment of the Roman religion with other elements. So they quite happily repackage and roll things up.
They certainly do. Yeah, so I think this idea of the Circus Maximus as being part of a multi-purpose space, I think is really useful to think about, particularly for this early period. So there's the theory that is put out in some of the written sources that the Circus Maximus was kind of created by the Etruscan king par excellence, Lucius Tarquinius, and that may or may not be just a bit of a story trying to connect that cultural element. But the fact that we've got all of this sort of layered meaning over time, I think is really key and crucial for appreciating what is happening as Rome progresses through its own history, as you say, and also thinking about what might have been the touch points for the really early stuff as well.
Just one final thing on there, just because I want to sell it even more. If something big happened in ancient Rome, it happened at the Circus Maximus. That's where most likely you had gladiator fights. That's where you had ceremonies. People think of the Colosseum as being this big centralized, and almost until Rome had a Colosseum, they just didn't put anything on. No, all the stuff used to go on at the Circus Maximus. Again, later on. But if you're a general and you're looking to have a big ceremony or a big pomp and triumph, that's where it's going on. Julius Caesar has big fights there between various sort of sections of his army, or not his army, but kind of gladiator fight things going on there. It was a major cultural event, and it's weird because when you go to Rome, you don't see it as prominent as other sites, because again, other sites steal the eye a bit more, because when you go to it, it looks a bit more like it does now, or it would have done back then, sort of flat piece of ground. But when you go to it, just know that is real old school Roman.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to keep in mind for people who are traveling to Rome and seeing it today is that the Circus Maximus retains some of its amazingness simply because that space continues to this day to be utilized for big events. So if there is a big concert happening and a huge band comes to Rome, they will often be performing at the Circus Maximus. It is the perfect location for giant events where you want lots of people. The way that it's laid out, the way that it has this gentle sort of sloping area to it allows you to accommodate a whole bunch of people who are able to still have a view on whatever it is that's being put on. So it is actually continues to be a really multifunctional space for Rome in that sense. So, leading to thinking a little bit further outside of Rome now. Ostia. So Ostia is the spot that crops up at the mouth of the Tiber River as it hits the Mediterranean Sea. So Rome, as we know, is a little bit inland. It's even more inland today than it was in the ancient period, because ancient Ostia is about 6 kilometers inland now from where the mouth of the river is now. So there's that whole shifting way in which soil moves around because of river movements means that Ostia is now inland. But I would highly recommend anybody go to Ostia Antica. It is incredible. I don't think I'm done exploring that site. But it becomes pivotal to Roman power and pivotal to thinking about power in the region in this early regal period as well. So there are some traditional stories associated with Ostia crediting the founding of it to the fourth king, Ancus Marcius. And this sort of initial colony seems to be based around control, but also maybe the potential for harvesting salt as much as anything else. But Rome is not the preeminent power in the region when we're thinking about the regal period. So I'm interested in your thoughts on why Ostia is important and what sort of conflicts they may have faced trying to come to grips with controlling this region.
Yeah, well, thanks. I think that you summed up, you've hit across a number of really important points when you're considering Ostia. So the first thing is that you mentioned is about, again, I keep saying topography, but it is quite inland. It says 4 or 6 kilometers or thereabouts inland from where it would have been. And when you're considering the ancient world, consider coastlines, consider how much they changed. If you've been to Pompeii, it was thought that Pompeii was by the coast. I went to Richborough in Kent last year, and Richborough was a beachhead for the Roman invasion or the Claudian invasion. It's a good couple kilometers inland. But if you look at how it was when Claudius, it was this little island. It's just a little island off just on with a narrow connection to the mainland. And Ephesus, places like that. These are places which would have looked very different. And I spoke about how the Tiber moved as well. And again, the Tiber does move in this instance as well, which kind of confuses things and makes things more difficult to understand what really went on. So the points that you make about it being strategic are pretty much the rationale. If you wanted to boil down, why does Rome need Ostia? Well, it needs it for three main reasons. The first is that it has access to salt. There are a couple of salt lagoons there, which are really important. Very nice resource. It means that it can get access to wider trading networks, because if you've got a port that sits just inland. Now, you mentioned it, I think you described it really well, that this wasn't a port on the coast. This was a river port, but it was just in the mouth. In fact, Ostia, I believe, comes from mouth of. It's sort of association of that word, meaning that it was the mouth of the river. And it would have sat just as you came in the river, it would have sat on the south bank. It was a natural harbour that they developed into a port, which made perfect sense. And the final reason why, this is the third reason why Rome needed this, was because if you've got access to who comes in and out of the Tiber, then you're far more secure, because after all, you are downriver of it, or upriver, or whichever way the tide goes. So you needed it for three main reasons, really: security, you needed it for commerce, and you needed it for a second reason for commerce, for salt. And again, I know we spoke about civilization and the importance of salt. So yeah, this was really important for Rome. The difficulty with it all is putting together anything which really builds up a picture of what Ostia could have looked like before the 4th century BC. Mainly because there's one main building at Ostia that dates to that period. It's the earliest building that's been dating. It's known as a sort of tower. It's the castrum. Though that said, there is debate about what it did, and the reason I say that is because the Tiber River changed its course between I think it's between the 8th and 6th centuries or thereabouts. It changed its course quite heavily. And so where we think of the castrum being located now to the river, back then it would have been about 600 meters away from the river. So the idea that it was this defensive tower protecting the river doesn't really seem to add up. So it's not confused, but it's unsure. Perhaps the classification of that building initially may not be what it was originally intended for. So there's a bit of debate over as to what that was. But the central to this is you have these salted lagoons. You have these lagoons which become enclosed by sort of natural processes Now, these obviously you can get salt from. Salt's very important. Determining determining activity, human activity, there is quite difficult, mainly because there isn't a great deal of archaeological evidence that goes back. However, again, there was a paper which I read, and it looked at some of the drainage channels that were dug, but connecting the salt lagoon to the sea, and it seemed strange that there had been a couple drainage channels that had been maintained. Well, no one maintains channels naturally; they have to be done by people. And the dating of this maintaining of these drainage channels to ensure that the canals connected the salt lagoon to the sea could date as far back as the 9th century BC up till the 6th century BC. So what I think we probably had, if we were forced to come up with a speculative suggestion about what's going on here, is that you probably had peoples who were using that lagoon for salt. And what Rome did was early on, it seemed to have got hold of that resource. Exactly when, we're not sure, because again, we got the earliest building as 4th century BC. But prior to that, it's highly probable that you had something there because, again, stone buildings, when it comes to Roman fortifications, stone buildings are the latter. You don't rock up and just build a stone thing. Generally speaking,
What?
that is, yeah, yeah, crazy.
You're telling me the Romans didn't come fully formed out of the womb as world dominators?
No, you're mixing it. You're mixing
I'm
up.
shocked.
You're mixing it up because it's Swede. It was the Vikings who had IKEA, so they could just have flat pack everything, bring it over to build it. Romans didn't have that. They didn't have their. Although they did do, obviously, the when I say flat pack, I'm immediately now thinking of the Punic Wars where they nicked the boat design from the Phoenicians. But anyway, from Carthage. Anyway, that aside, what generally happens, developments, and we see this. I did some work and I did a podcast with Dr. Andrew Tibbs, and he was speaking about Roman fortifications in Scotland. And what people don't realize is most of the time, due to drone technology, you can see these things far easier now because you can see the pattern on the ground. Because otherwise, you could be walking across one and not realize it's there because they would have been originally wood. The Antonine wall, a wall, never got past the turf stage. It was just originally made of earth. You'd make something of earth or wood, and then you'd build it up if you needed it to, because again, sometimes fortifications were temporary. What seems to have happened with the Tiber is it's changed course. So again, you don't have access to perhaps the areas which would give us evidence. So again, it's not that we don't have the evidence there. There could be some fantastic archaeological evidence to determine which we could date activity around this area. The problem is because the Tiber has moved course, it might be directly under the Tiber now, or it could be under some houses near the. But locating exactly where everything was at this period is still a bit speculative. It's not where necessarily it is now. What you have now with Ostia, again, it doesn't suffer so much because it is a site which I'd love to visit and I've heard is wonderful, and it annoys me that I haven't been there. So stop bringing it up. Is that you have a much more modern, and by that you have the later Republic period. They go all in on Ostia because it's such an important location. It's so integral. Particularly, I think that's where the fleet for, again, Punic Wars, that's where the fleet's based. So it's so important to have that developed. So you look at it then and think, yeah, but that probably wasn't what it looked like 400 years before. In fact, it might have been in a different place. And Roman port design and way that Roman linked up, eventually Ostia is not abandoned because it's still kept there, but they then move it. You have Claudius who sort of redevelops the site, and then you have the basin, the famous basin, which is this. I think it's an octagon you can actually see from the sky if you look.
Oh,
Apparently, if you're flying into one of Rome's, the portus, you can actually see it. It's there. It's this perfect. Again, I don't know if it's an octagon. It's got a lot of sides to it, and it's not a circle, but it looks like a circle. That's my maths for you. You can actually make that out, and that was on the coast.
That was Trajan.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it had a lighthouse as well, which is very nice if you like that kind of thing. But anyway, going back to Ostia, again, it's one of those places which we know was strategically very important to Rome for a number of reasons, but our hands are tied somewhat in understanding more about it because of the way it sits now and because of the structures that are on it now. And this is always a problem because if you've got a site in antiquity that becomes really popular, it's usually popular for a reason that resonates in later ages. So again, you don't have that. You have that issue. I visited Bath, Roman Bath, a good few years ago, and under it you can go, if you go downstairs and you're looking around the Roman remains, and they got I think it was this front of this temple, and it looks amazing, and they said we can't excavate it. We've got this fantastic, but we can't excavate it because that will probably bring down Bath Cathedral, which would be, I understand, a bad thing.
That would be a shame.
That would be, yeah. And I've been to Bath Cathedral. It's a lovely building. I think it's Bath. Yeah, it's a cathedral. I'm pretty sure, but it doesn't have great foundations. So you've got this, and you've got this in modern Rome now. And again, I think with the Tullianum, it's a great example. If I wanted to go and excavate the Tullianum now, it's probably not going to happen, because it's now sitting above a church. So how do you go about that? It's got all of these, not restrictions, but blocks to me being able to do that. So we have to go on what we know, which is again limited but frustrating. But yeah, Ostia,
it is the curse of Regal Rome.
Yes, they just did it too well. So you almost sympathise. And again, we're in this is great, because we're in a similar place to Livy. We're trying to work things out. It's just that we're a bit more responsible to our methods than Livy was. Though he was obviously a very nice guy, he's quite happy to say, yep, it was named that. Stick it to a king. Who can we allocate it? Pick a number, any number. Oh, you've picked 4.
The best kings, naturally.
Yeah, yeah. Stick it to that, and then we could talk about how great the Republic was in terms of reshaping it. But these were important spaces, both culturally and early on in Rome's development. They were developed early for a reason. There was a great importance placed on efficiency. You didn't just go, fancy developing that area because it's nice. And in a few hundred years, 800 years, 900 years, 1,000 years, well, it'll be worth quite a few quid. People want to build flats there. You're doing it because the immediate generation requires that resource and that input.
We'd like a little less malaria, please.
Yeah, a bit less.
These hills are nice and all, but man, the mosquitoes.
Yeah, it's too much. It's too much.
Well, thank you so much, Neil, for sitting down with us and taking us through some of these fascinating details, because I think it's always a useful exercise to go into that sort of exploratory space, like the intersections between what we can possibly know from an archaeological perspective, what we cannot possibly know because of the limits of that sort of understanding with continuous habitation and just our own inability to come to grips with the changing nature of the topography over time, which is a natural process and also a human interference process the further you go along. And to keep in mind that maybe we are all a bit like Livy. I really quite like that.
Yeah, we're trying to make the best of it. It's a bit like when you have these detective, they retrospectively find a detective in, the medieval period or whatnot, and you're like, okay, they're working to the same methods, it's just different technologies, and okay, they may not be doing the same way that we would do it. So I forget the name of, there was a brilliant show involved Cadfile. So there's Cadfile kicking around. If anyone's watched Cadfile,
I loved Cadfile.
He's not got CSI Miami. He's not. He can't do a zoom into someone's genetics on a Coke can or anything. But he's applying a simple metric that sort of works, and that's what Livy ultimately is doing, because there is a lot of pride here. But also, I think the other tricky thing we need to remember, and it is something which, again, you cover and touch upon in your book. Don't know which chapter though. And it's about, I'm still staring, and it's just about how we think of these spaces back in antiquity, and how we understand what we can possibly know about them. And as I said, that's something that I'm always, I wouldn't say tortured by, but you live in hope that something's going to pop up that's going to give you a bit more of an understanding. These are people trying to make decisions. And just going back to the point I made earlier, with Livy, I think there's a tension there, because how can you have all these great, fantastic things that were built by kings who were the worst? I mean, one of them was okay, but they were the worst.
Hey, whoa. Only one of them was really terrible.
That could have been the sort of bit for your book, Rex. The worst, just the worst.
Yeah.
Because that's it's an internal tension within the whole narrative of the Regal period. It's this that, yeah, so and so started it and they built it, but I'm always, and Livy often takes the old pot shots at people going, oh yeah, but they were, it did for them, but they were uncouth. They didn't mind their manners and the rest of it.
Uncouth, my goodness. Yeah. Shots fired, Livy.
Absolutely, Livy. He is dead, right? He's dead. He's not coming for me. I'm going to get someone pop on my social feed now.
You've certainly given me a lot to think about. I know that I'm definitely going to go to sleep tonight imagining, how would Livy's history be different if he had access to drone technology?
Yeah, and if nothing else, think of the My Little Pony show at the Circus Maximus, where they dressed up their horses and paraded them around and made them feel special.
Well, listeners, we hope that you have enjoyed listening to Neil's absolutely mind-blowing knowledge of the early geography of Rome. As you can tell, it is well worth listening to Ancient History Hound if you haven't already started already. And Neil, thank you so much for joining us. It's actually a very special episode, not just because it's a part 2, a sequel, which we don't often do, but because it's actually technically Dr. G's and my 11-year anniversary today.
Oh, today? Oh, my God.
It's actually on the 1st of March, but it's almost the 1st of March in our time. And it is also a leap year, so...
Oh, that's true.
And if you hear a knock at the door and there's someone with a present, that wasn't me. That was purely coincidence, but I'll take it. I just want to say thanks very much. I really appreciate you having me on and being able to talk, and I hope the listeners have really enjoyed it. Feel free to blame me.
The pleasure is all ours.
If you haven't enjoyed it, you can find me on social media.
I think we've established that we don't appreciate these sorts of comments.
5-star reviews only. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You can write whatever you want in the comment. 5 stars.
You know what? If you want to take your rage out at anyone, aim it at the podcasts that belong to massive networks. we're independents here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Partial Historians. A huge thank you to our Patreon supporters for helping make this show spectacular. If you enjoyed the show, there's a few ways that you can show your support. You can write a review wherever you listen in to help spread the word. Reviews really make our day and help new people find our podcast. Researching and producing a podcast takes time. If you're keen to chip in, you can buy us a coffee on Ko-Fi or join our fantastic Patreons for early releases and exclusive content. You can find our show notes, as well as links to our merch and where to buy our book, Rex, The 7 Kings of Rome, at partialhistorians.com. Until next time, we are yours in ancient Rome.